Have you ever considered quitting? Have you ever felt the need or this innate feeling of this just isn't worth it anymore? Have you ever felt like quitting because it's too hard? Or maybe it simply sucks? Or maybe the effort required is not worth the reward at the end? Whether you are doing something for yourself or professionally or creatively or even in the business sense, there have been many times where I know personally I felt like quitting, where I felt like I've just had enough, having a bad day, sometimes not even just a bad day, maybe I'm having a bad season, and I just don't feel like it's worth pursuing something. Like, how many times have you felt like that? How many times have you felt like maybe this isn't for me? Maybe I'm not for this. Maybe this isn't meant to be. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's your career path. Maybe it's a business. Maybe it's content creation. Whatever it is, how many times have you ever thought about quitting? I know I've felt like it so many times. And an interesting way to look at it is to try and not beat yourself up when you do quit. And I think this is something that is so wrong with today's society is we always demonize quitting. We look at quitting and think, oh, well, they just didn't persevere. They just weren't consistent. They weren't willing to put in the work. And maybe, just maybe, that might be true. And that might be true in certain scenarios, but is it true in all scenarios? I don't think so. And so it's interesting to me because we don't look at quitters and we don't praise them. But we also don't praise people who stay or overstay in places that they're not happy. We never praise the people who overstay their misery. So why don't we give grace to people who simply decided that something wasn't for them anymore? And that's what I want to focus on today. I want to focus on the idea that not that you should quit everything, but that you should be decisive and be final with when something isn't for you anymore. You give yourself the grace to say, you know what, this isn't for me anymore. And that's really, really what matters here, is to understand that quitting only matters when you have logically observed why you want to quit and you've decided to give it a day and call it a wrap. But how do you even decide? That's what's interesting. How do you decide whether or not you should be quitting? And there's this framework by Stephen Bartlett, which I think is phenomenal, which is called the quitting framework. And I think it's a pretty interesting framework that gives you a logical and objective overview onto why you should quit or why not. And the keyword that I want to highlight here is logical. It's a logical framework because quitting is emotional, or it can be most of the times. And so we get caught up in the emotion rather than just being logical and understanding, should I be quitting or should I not? So the framework goes something like this. Are you thinking of quitting? Are you thinking of quitting anything in your life at the moment? If not, then obviously ignore and skip this framework. But if you are thinking of quitting something in your life, then let's understand, is it because it's hard or is it because it sucks? Now, you might say, but Eric, I feel both. To me, it's hard and it sucks. But usually, one of those things is more dominant. It might be that you are misunderstanding the feelings. It might be that it's hard, and as a result, it also sucks. Or it might be that it sucks, and as a result, it's also felt hard. But usually it's one that triggers the other. Usually one is more dominant than the other. So let's start with the hard part. Let's say that you are considering quitting because it's hard. The next question that you need to ask yourself is the effort and the hardship and the struggle worth the reward at the end? If yes, then do not quit. If it is worth the reward at the end, if the struggle and the hardship are worth the reward, then do not quit, because you know that everything's going to pay off in the end. So If it is worth it, do not quit. If it's not, then quit. Because not only are you suffering because it's hard, but you're also now going to be miserable at the end of it because it won't be worth the reward in the end. So that's that side of the coin. Now, the other side of the coin is because it sucks. So if you're thinking of quitting because it sucks, then there's two questions here that follow up. One is, are you thinking of quitting because it sucks? And is there anything that you can do to make it not suck? And I know that sounds like a hilarious question to ask, but I'm being genuine. I'm being serious. Can you make it not suck? Is there anything that you can do to make it feel easier or better when you're pursuing this? And if the answer is no, there isn't anything that I can do to make it not suck, then you should quit. Because you're going to be miserable and there's nothing that you can do to make it less painful. So you should quit if there's nothing you can do to make it not suck. However, on the flip side, if the answer is yes, if there is something that you can do to make it not suck, then the next question is the effort required to make it not suck worth the reward at the end? And here's where you have to be honest with yourself. Is the effort required to make it not suck worth the reward? If the answer is yes, do not quit. If the answer is no, then quit. Because there's nothing that you can do. If you've been honest with yourself and you've come to the conclusion that no, the effort required to make it not suck will not be worth the reward at the end, then there's nothing that you can do and you have to quit. And that's just a logical overview. And that's the summary of the quitting framework by Stephen that, to me, really puts you on the spot with these questions to try and analyze why are you thinking of quitting and is there anything that you can do? Now, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is a frame that Alex Hormozi uses, and he kind of calls this the push or pivot. So Hormozi looks at quitting as doing nothing. Therefore, the equal opposite force of quitting would be doing something. And so if quitting means doing nothing, anything other than doing nothing would be doing something. So whether you are pushing, meaning you carry down the same path, or whether you are pivoting, which means you change paths, both of those things are you doing something. Both of those things are activity. So pushing or pivoting is activity. It means doing something. It means you are pursuing something, which is the equal opposite force of quitting, which is doing nothing. Now, how do you decide whether you should keep pushing down the path that you've chosen or whether you should be pivoting to a different path? So Hormozi talks about looking at data, assumptions, and evidence. And the overview is something along the lines of, basically, when you first made that decision, there was a set of data, a set of assumptions that you made, and you made those assumptions based on the data and evidence that you had at the time. That said, okay, I'm choosing this decision, I'm choosing this path because I have X, Y, and Z as assumptions that I've made. And here's the $1 million question here, is, has anything changed since then? Is there any new evidence that has come to light that contradicts your initial set of assumptions or that changes your initial set of assumptions? If the answer is no, no data has come to light, no evidence, no new evidence has come to light that contradicts or changes my initial beliefs about this decision, then you should keep pushing because nothing's changed. You might be having a hard day, you might be having a hard season, but truly nothing has changed. That's one way to look at it. But then the other one is, let's say that there is new evidence that has changed or contradicted your initial beliefs or your initial assumptions. Then in that instance, you should definitely be pivoting. because you've got new data that is literally telling you that your initial assumptions or initial set of beliefs have changed. And so you know that you should be pivoting because you have the evidence to back that. So it's a very simple and a very straightforward way of looking at things because there's no room for maybes. It's very straightforward, right? Whether you're using the framework by Stephen, whether you're using the frame by Alex Hormozy, there is a lot of logic and objectiveness to just should you be quitting or should you not? Should you be pushing or should you be pivoting? Right? That's really what we're talking about. And when we talk about pivoting and pushing and quitting or pursuing, something that comes to mind a lot to me, especially as I think about the big decisions in my life, and I think about them a lot. One thing that comes to my mind is what slows me down, or what slows people down in general. Is there anything that slows people down? And I think of, well, there's many things. There is consistency, or actually no, a lack of consistency is something that slows people down. Another thing is actually being a perfectionist. And so what I'm referring to now is pursuing something. When you are pursuing something, right, you can think of speed. And if you think of the things that slow you down, lack of consistency is one. But another one is being a perfectionist. And I mentioned that because I saw this quote the other day and I thought it was a pretty good quote. And it was from Chris Williamson, and it was something along the lines of perfectionism is basically just procrastination in disguise. And I thought that was a pretty good way to summarize how we sometimes can lean into this idea that we are perfectionists just to use it as an excuse to procrastinate doing something. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And it made me think, in which areas of my life have I done that? In which areas have I procrastinated via being a perfectionist? Because when you are a real perfectionist, you are trying to get things done. You are actively actually trying to get it done. You're not delaying it. You're not being picky about things that do not matter. You are actually trying to get it done. You obsess over things that actually matter. You don't obsess over the things that don't matter. I know, we should sweat the small stuff. I know I certainly do. But I don't care about certain details that are not relevant to the path that I'm trying to pursue. But I can think of times in my life where I've probably been a perfectionist, but it was more me delaying something. It was me avoiding something. It was me procrastinating something. And so when I think about it, are you being a perfectionist most of the times, or are you just being a procrastinator? Are you actually trying to get things done, or are you subconsciously just putting things off by saying that you need to do more? You don't need to get it perfect, you just need to get it done. And there's another saying around how done is better than perfect. And I agree. Because if you're trying to get it perfect, you might never get it done. Whereas if you're trying to get it done, you will do everything that you need to get it done. And done is better than perfect, because perfect is this superficial, artificial metric that most of the times you won't even reach. And you won't do that because it's really difficult to define what is perfect. But it's easy to define what is good. I think defining what looks good is very, very easy. You can easily define it. But perfect is this metric that I find it personally quite hard to say what is perfect. I look at it as like focus on progress, not perfect, focus on progression, not perfection. And I live my life through that, and I try to lead myself in that way so that I don't get caught up in these irrelevant perfectionism patterns that I can sometimes have. And overthinking, we could talk about how overthinking kind of feeds that perfectionism narrative, because that's another thing. I do consider myself an overthinker. And so I tend to fall into perfectionism patterns quite a lot. But when I catch myself, I'm always like, okay, cool. Well, I need to get it done. That's what's important here. So let me give you personal examples to make it relatable. in terms of quitting and in terms of being perfectionism. So quitting, there's an example that I can think of, which is my career professionally was a career in the software engineering space. I was a software engineer for the first few years of my career. In fact, majority of my career up until today has been in software engineering. And I transitioned 2 years ago into being an agile delivery manager. So I went from the person who was doing the coding to the person who manages the projects and the teams and the people doing the coding. So still in the tech space, still in the software development space, just doing a slightly different role, and actually a role that plays a lot more to my strengths and that plays a lot more to what I'm better suited for. But that's just a side note. Anyways, a lot of people could look at it and be like, well, Eric quit software engineering. I call it a transition, right? Pivoting, like Hormozi says. But even if that's the case, let's just say, yeah, okay, I quit software engineering. I don't want to overstay somewhere where I know I'm not meant to be or that I'm suitable for. So that's an example of something that I quit because to me, it just wasn't worth the reward. To me, it just wasn't worth pursuing. Whereas now I'm in something that makes me happier, that makes me more fulfilled, that makes me feel like I am adding meaningful contribution and value in my workplace. And I feel a lot better for it. But imagine if I just carried down the path of being that software engineer and just forced myself to be only in that box. I would have never gotten out of that box if I felt like that's all I could ever be or do. So that's one example that comes to my mind when we talk about quitting. Because yes, I quit, but I did it because it made sense. Logically, it made sense. And today I am so grateful for it. An example about something that I was maybe a perfectionist over, well, I can think of many, but maybe the podcast is something that I was very perfectionist over. And to a point where it delayed me starting the podcast. So I started it in 2020. And when I think about it, it was quite late. 2020, I started it, but that's not when I first thought about it. I've thought about doing a podcast way before 2020. 2020 was not the first time I thought about it. And so what was the delay? If I had thought about it maybe 1 or 2 years before 2020, but I never actually acted on it, then what happened there? And what happened is simple. I was just being a perfectionist. Oh, I need this, or I need that. Oh, I cannot start a podcast unless I have this set of conditions, or unless I have this environment, or unless I have X, Y, and Z. And so I kept making excuses and excuses and excuses. And that's really all it is. It's just a bunch of excuses. Now, it doesn't mean that they weren't valid. And I kind of want to speak to that because sometimes we talk about excuses and we almost invalidate excuses. We talk about them in a way that almost invalidates excuses. But I want to be very, very honest with it. Those were excuses, yes, but they were valid. I had reasons and they were valid, but they were still excuses. Because if something's important enough to you, you still make it work, you still make it happen, and you overcome those barriers and those excuses and those obstacles. So I just want to point that out. So I was a perfectionist about how I wanted the podcast to look, to sound, to feel, and to be. And that delayed me by 1 or 2 years from launching the podcast. Now imagine if I had launched the podcast 2 years earlier than 2020. I would have had 2 years of more progress by now. Now I'm not regretful of that, and I if I could go back in time, of course I would do things differently. But my point is, those little details that I was obsessing over didn't really matter in the end. In the end, all that mattered was me starting and me getting it done. Not getting it perfect, because I didn't, and you can go back and listen to the first few episodes I made. I mean, even from a speaking perspective, I was using a lot of filler words like, like. So I was very repetitive sometimes in the way that I spoke. I wasn't shifting the tone enough. So there was a lot of little things that I noticed from when I listen back to those episodes, I'm like, whoa, what a shift, what an evolution. And so I wasn't perfect at the time, but I was getting it done. And that's what mattered. It's putting in the repetitions, it's putting in the reps, it's practicing, and I want to make this clear, because practice doesn't make perfect. A lot of people think that practice makes perfect. It doesn't. Feedback makes perfect, right? It's when you analyze yourself And then you practice with an iteration of improvement because you've analyzed yourself. Like, I improved my speaking abilities by listening to every single episode back and realizing where I could have said something better, where I could have done something better. And I'm going to do the same with this episode right here. I'm going to watch it back and watch where I could have used a different word, where I could have phrased it in a different way, where I could have posed a different question, where I could have used a different statement. And I'm doing that not because I'm being harsh on myself or obsessing over mistakes or details, but simply because I want to be better. I want to come here the next time and do a better job. I want to come here next time and do a killer job, an even more killer job than I did previously. And that's the bar. The bar is so high for me. It's like, how can I come here and make another episode that is better than the previous one? And actually, how can I even make sure that every single episode is better than the last one? That's the goal. And that's a really high bar to set for myself, but that's how I get better. And tying back to the point that I was making earlier, had I carried on being a perfectionist, maybe I would have started the podcast in 2024. And that's like now 6 years from when I thought about it first in 2018. And those are 6 years that I would have wasted and lost, a lot of learnings that I would have missed out on, because I've learned a lot since I've started. And so the bottom line is, don't quit something if it's worth the reward and you can find a way to make it not suck. And if not, quit something because it's not meant to you. And logically, you shouldn't be spending time where you feel like you're not being the most effective at and where you feel like you're not going to get anything out of it at the end of it. And don't slow yourself down with these excuses and this obsession over details and what you call perfectionism, where most of the times is actually just procrastination. Don't let yourself be caught up in those patterns that slow you down and then take away from what you're trying to achieve or what you're trying to pursue. Now, here's the segment that we've introduced recently that I've been quite enjoying, which is called the Just a Moment. This is a segment of the podcast where we take the conversation cards from Stephen Bartlett and the Diary of a CEO, and whatever question comes out of that card, I have to answer. So depending on the question, we might get a bit deep here, or maybe it'll be an easy one. We'll see. And then basically I'll ask you the question back and you can just drop it in the comments and let me know what your answers were. So let's do this. Let's see what question we have today. So let me open this. I actually let you see the question first. Right. So you are seeing it first. Okay. Let's see what we have here. What has been the most happiest moment of your life, brought you the most joy, and why? This was asked by Alex Scott on Stephen's podcast, and it was answered by Chris Kamara. Right, what has been the most happiest moment of your life, brought you the most joy, and why? Okay, let me think about it. I can think of two moments that were really, really special to me and that made me happy. I think happiest is a big stretch because I've had my fair share of happy moments. So trying to pick the happiest moment can be quite difficult. But I can certainly think of one, and I'll tell you the context around this because I feel like context is so important. So I've spoken before on a podcast how during university. So I moved from Portugal to the UK to do university, and I was working 2 part-time jobs at the same time, and I would work Fridays and weekends and a few hours here and there during the weekdays. And when there was Christmas holidays or summer holidays or Easter holidays from uni, I would just increase my shift patterns and increase the hours that I was working. So I was working a lot. And I remember on my first year of uni, the first semester, that was the first Christmas. Everyone went back home. I didn't, because there was exams in January, and I was decided that I'm going to work throughout the Christmas period so that I can, make an extra set of money for that month. And so what I would do normally is during university, the money that I was making from that part-time jobs from those part-time jobs, I was basically just using to sustain myself. And during the holidays, if I made any extra, then I would just keep it as savings. That first Christmas, and I'll never forget this, what I did was I worked and I made a bit of extra. So I used what I usually use to sustain myself. And then the rest I saved because I wanted to give back to my mom when I went home. So December, worked part-time job, did lots of shifts, did lots of hours. By the way, I'm getting paid like £5 an hour, right? And so I had to put in a lot of hours to make something decent. And January came, I did my exams. As soon as my exams were done, I flew back home to Portugal to go spend some time with my family before I had to come back to start my second semester. And I remember this as if it was yesterday. Believe it or not, I genuinely remember this as if it was yesterday. But growing up, we've always had a lot of struggle financially, and life was very hard, and it wasn't easy at all. Parents divorced, my mom by herself trying to raise me and my brother. So, without going into too much detail, you can kind of imagine the setting. And this was the first time that I had managed to make extra money from a part-time job. And so it was the first time that I was going to give money to my family. And I just remember this so vividly. I remember coming home and I had already withdrew money from the bank and I had already converted it from pounds to euros because in Portugal we use euros. And I remember just at night time going to my mom and just like handing her over like €250 converted. And as I handed this over to her, I started crying. And my mom was like, "Why are you crying?" And I was like, "I don't know." And it's true. At the time, I didn't know why. And she was like, "But why?" And I was like, "I don't know, I'm just happy." And I remember saying that to her. I remember saying, "I'm just happy." And in hindsight, as I reflect on that, that moment was important to me because I felt like I was helping my family. Like it was the first time in my life where I felt like, okay, we might be able to change the trajectory of our life here. And so those were tears of joy. They weren't tears of sadness or tears of frustration. They were just tears of joy. But I remember it as if it was yesterday. And of course, today I give back to my family a lot more than that amount. But it's crazy to me how even I didn't know why at the time I just started crying. It was so uncontrolled. But it was happiness. It was happiness and this feeling of like things will change. We're going to change things around in our lives. And so that to me, to this day, still feels like one of the happiest moments, and one of the moments that brought me the most joy. And yeah, so that's one of the moments that I've thought about. I'd love to hear from you and what you would think is your most happiest moment in your life. What has brought you the most joy, and why? So drop it in the comments. I'll be reading them and I'll be replying to all the comments. And I'd be super, super intrigued to see what you share with me. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode. Thank you for watching this episode. I appreciate you a lot more than you know. The fact that you guys watch, listen, support, like, share, all of the good stuff, it really helps the podcast grow so much. And I only have one favor to ask you, right? If you've enjoyed the podcast, if you've learned anything from it, if you've found value from it, just one favor. If you could hit the subscribe button, that would mean the world to me. And it would help the podcast grow. And the more the podcast grows, the more I can carry on doing this for you guys. So if you could please hit the subscribe button, that would mean the world to me. Thank you.